Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I'm very pleased to be with you, if I may say so, today. My talk is about something apparently very French, which is a theoretical quarrel between two French philosophers, Jean-François Lyotard and Jacques Rancière. But I hope that I will be able to show you that this quarrel is not only French, of course, but that it had and still has a very important influence on art theory, and politics. So I start. So the theoretical conflict that opposed Lyotard and Rancière has marked a decisive shift in the theory of art at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. This is not, as I said, a simple quarrel between French intellectuals, because in this confrontation, nothing less than the vision of the political role of art has been transformed. This quarrel is all the more surprising that Lyotard and Rancière are, in fact, in agreement on several points. Let's recall them before moving to the controversy. So what are the common points? First, for both of them, art is now, and when I say now, it's again like the second half of the 20th century, art is now able to address the question of its own political status without depending any longer on a philosophy of art. And all the more so since the latter, like philosophy of art, in its traditional form, has precisely failed to elaborate this question. Second, for both, what I call the political question is defined as the originary recognition of a wrong, a tort in French. This wrong consists in the harm done to certain subjects who find themselves immediately and paradoxically excluded from the political sphere. Some citizens are right from the start pushed outside the circle of citizenship itself. Such is the origin of what Lyotard has called the différent, with a D, different, and Rancière, disagreement, that are both consubstantial with politics. So let me explain a little bit. If it is true, as Aristotle says in Politics, that the difference between humans and animals coincides with that which exists between the noise and the logos, it is just as true as that certain subjects who nevertheless possess the logos are driven out of its jurisdiction and not allowed to speak. Their language is purely and simply considered animal noise. In his book, Misère de la philosophie, I don't think it has been translated into English. It might be translated as philosophy's misery. In Misère de la philosophie, Lyotard writes that what he calls the sentence affect is precisely the inarticulate utterance of those who cannot make themselves heard in the public space. Politics, the domain par excellence of articulated language, necessarily harms the rumor that it pretends not to hear. And Lyotard refers on this point to the famous passage in which Aristotle distinguishes between what he calls the articulated voice, proper to human beings and required by membership in the political community, and what he called the mixed or confused voice, which is the prerogative of animals in general. And Lyotard writes, politics consists in the fact that language is sometimes not a language. So politics starts with, at the moment when language is in fact at war with itself, what Lyotard calls a dispute. So for both Lyotard and Rancière, in fact, disagreement and différent correspond at first sight to the same definition. They seem to agree, and this time I quote Rancière, that both disagreement and différend characterize, I quote, a determined type of speech situation that where one of the interlocutors both hears and does not hear what the other is saying. Isn't it a question then between disagreement and différend of the same acknowledgement of the failure of the logos, of the impossibility of being heard, of letting people speak, of doing justice, of the non-existence of a general rule to which all the parties could refer? It seems clear for both Lyotard and Rancière that politics in general implements various discursive regimes that remain foreign to each other. Différend and disagreement come from the impossibility of speaking in the same way about the same thing. They both arise from the inability of the logos to do justice to the non-logical, incapacity which causes politics to escape from philosophy. This flight out of philosophy, of its logical sentences, marks for the two thinkers the birth of contemporary art. Art then becomes the site of expression of the political impossibility of expression. Yet, it is on these fundamental points, the relationship between art and politics, that the agreement between the two philosophers breaks down. Thus, on several occasions, Rancière vehemently rejects any comparison of his category of disagreement with that of Lyotard's différend. I quote Rancière: "The disagreement is distinguished from what Jean-François Lyotard conceptualized under the name of différend." Why? Because for Lyotard, as we will see, contemporary art deals with the political question in the regime of the unpresentable, which is a translation of the French impresentable, while for Rancière, it produces and is produced as a new regime of representation. Hence my title, Unpresentable and Irrepresentable and Representable. At stake in this conflict between the unpresentable Lyotard and the representable Rancière, so at stake in this conflict of art regimes is phenomenality, that is the status of phenomenality understood here as the sensitive translation of non-articulated or inarticulate language. The sensitive translation of what does not meet the principles, standards, phrases of the oligarchic political arena. In a word, art has become the sensitive translation of the original anarchy that constitutes the hidden backdrop of all politics. I quote from Rancière: "Politics has no arche. It is in the strict sense anarchic," Rancière declares. Anarchy doesn't mean disorder, but this other order, that of a radical equality between the people and the powerful, between those who speak and those who cannot be heard. And Lyotard, for his part, affirms in his 1973 text, La Cinema, the A Cinema, the kinship between experimental art and anarchism. But the quarrel comes back. For Lyotard, anarchism cannot be presented. To present it would be to contradict it, hence his concept of the unpresentable art. But Rancière, for his part, affirms, on the contrary, that leaving anarchy in the shadow of the unpresentable makes it a victim ideology unable to constitute an actual front of resistance. So it is in the name of this new necessity to represent anarchy that Rancière dismisses both the unpresentable and the unrepresentable. He confuses the two with a kind of contempt. He says, in fact, what Lyotard called the impresentable, the unpresentable, is just an unrepresentable. And this means the same thing, and we have to give up these two concepts. So I will now develop a little the two conceptions of the relationship between original anarchy, original political anarchy, and art. And I start with Rancière. The disagreement for Rancière is very old. It stems from the fact that radical political equality, which was the foundation of democracy from the dawn of the 5th century in Greece, can never be translated into arithmetical equality, A equal B equals C. And this is the problem. Radical equality, which is the basis of democracy, has immediately become a geometric equality, that is a ratio of proportion that Rancière analyzes as the passage from the cardinal 1, 2, 3 to the ordinal 1st, 2nd, 3rd. The political imperative then reads, and I quote Rancière, put those who are worth more above those who are worth less. So we see the passage how equality gives way to 1st, 2nd, 3rd. Those who have nothing are the last. Such is the structure of the disagreement that lies at the center of politics, which is that politics is not able to guarantee the radical equality that is at the same time its origin. However, for Rancière, this scrapping of those who lack parts, as he says, who get no share from the political sharing of power, strictly speaking, does not cause any victims. And this is the difference with Lyotard. I quote, the concept of wrong does not bind to any dramaturgy of victimization. The chain of synonyms, disagreement, dissensus, wrong, dispute, miscount, does not refer to any catastrophe or tragedy. Of course, Rancière affirms this to counter Lyotard's point of view that the Holocaust can be taken as a paradigm of political annihilation, an extreme form of the exclusion and destruction of original political anarchism. According to Lyotard, art becomes contemporary when its task becomes that of responding to the traumatic events of the 20th century as they radicalize the sacrifice of those who originally could not speak, but only cry or moan. So you see that for Lyotard, in fact, the Holocaust, and is the Shoah, is a radicalization of the originally different. The paradoxical task of art then consists in impresenting, non-presenting, so to speak, this sacrifice in the works. And Lyotard, as we know, refers this task to the Kantian sublime, which challenges the imagination to configure the infinite overcoming of sensitive thresholds. This challenge of the impossible that the sublime is has ended up inscribing the unpresentable at the heart of contemporary art. Lyotard does make a difference between unpresentable and unrepresentable. To understand this difference, we must return, he says, to the Kantian distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, as presented in the third critique, as we know. What has a form, an aspect, is beautiful and gives pleasure. The feeling of the sublime, by contrast, is related to the formless, in German formlos. The imagination, Kant explains, which would like to play its usual role of mediator, tries to present to reason this defeat of form, but it fails. Vorstellung, which is representation in German, belongs to the realm of the beautiful. Darstellung, on the contrary, belongs to that of the sublime. The sublime emerges from the shock of the failure of imagination, from this encounter with the infinite of the formless, whose Darstellung, presentation, can only be negative. So Darstellung, linked with the sublime, Lyotard explains, is a presentation of the unpresentable. It is impresentable, so to speak. And Lyotard remarks that the Kantian sublime already has the structure of a différent between the faculties. The conflict of reason and imagination, he writes, quoting Kant, I quote, is not an ordinary dispute, which a third instance can seize and decide, but a différent, a Widerstreit in German. So that's why the analytic of the sublime in Kant brings to light the heterogeneity of the rules specific to each faculty, which prohibits any transfer of these rules from one faculty to the other. Rancière reacts very violently against this privilege given to the sublime. He once again denies the difference between the unpresentable and the unrepresentable. They return to the same thing, he affirms. And they testify, both of them testify to the same flight from the task of giving the original anarchy its aesthetic expression. For Rancière, an artistic staging, what he calls a staging, which is in French, une mise en scène, an artistic staging of the disagreement is possible, which phenomenalizes it, which allows it to appear. Without this staging, the resistance of the excluded could not be perceptible. Labor movements of the first half of the 19th century, formation of the Commune in Paris, revolution of 1968, recent occupation movements. It is not enough for these events to historically take place to appear. They only become truly visible at the cost of their aesthetic and artistic reconfiguration. Art is then the scenic metamorphosis or scripted distribution of politics. A new topology is obtained from a change of place between politics or history and art, which regulates the regime of visibility of the disagreements. Such is, for Rancière, the true political function of art, its genuine destination, which, I quote, displaces a body from the place assigned to it by politics to change the destination of a place. It makes visible what had no place to be seen, makes a discourse heard when only noise had its place, makes heard as discourse what was heard only as noise. This new sharing of the sensible, as Rancière calls it, this redistribution, I quote again, breaks the space where parts or lack of parts have been defined. This break is manifest in a series of actions that reconfigure what by definition has no place, the part of those who have no parts. This rupture is manifested by a series of acts that refigure the space where the parts and the absence of parts were defined, end of quote. So in a certain sense, the new artistic staging of the political redistributes the sharing of the parts, of the political parts. Nevertheless, art is not there to fix politics, Rancière explains. It is itself political through and through, in that it allows the displacement of politics towards its form. So in fact, art refigures politics by giving politics a form. And a form, Rancière says, is an entry into reality. So he strongly disagrees with the concept of formless, of the formless. The disagreement with Lyotard appears here in all its magnitude. Unlike the différent, the wrong, even deep, can be dealt with for Rancière, and this in and through aesthetic displacement. I quote Rancière, what is not adjustable is not for all that intractable. The wrong is not resolved by objectification of the dispute and compromise between the parties, but it is treated by devices of subjectivation, which make it consist as a modifiable relation between the parts, as the very modification of the terrain on which it stands. So it may be objected to Rancière that Lyotard also asserts that art, like philosophy, must invent new ways of speaking. The unpresentable in Lyotard is not mute nor deprived of phenomenological resources, but art for Lyotard can only be an abstract art, which does not figure. It can only be a trace. I quote from his text, La Cinéma. He characterizes as anarchic, as I said, the experimental cinema, which does justice to the, I quote, always singular, disruptive character of the plastic event, escaping predictability, otherwise it would be prefigured, recognizability, identifiability, referentiality, the putting into codes, forms, and isotopic and pre-established structures. Further, the revolutionary problem would rather be posed in terms of a loss of consciousness. So for Lyotard, there's no point in changing society for something which, while being different, would keep the same form. So clearly, for Lyotard, the form is always identifiable. That's why putting a conflict, giving a form to a conflict tends to deny the conflict. Despite everything, for Rancière, such a conception, which constitutes the unconsciousness or the sublime as an instrument of ethical and political interpretation of the catastrophes of the 20th century, has become the unfortunate aesthetic political experience of post-modernity. And this idea of art witnessing the sublime is for Rancière the expression of an untenable conception of art as of politics today. I quote, testifying that there is something unpresentable would be the imperative dictated in the aftermath of catastrophe and disaster, which demands the transformation of sublime feeling into a form of art. For him, the unpresentable is a symptom more than a concept. It denounces, I quote, the inflationary use of the notion of the unrepresentable and of a whole series of notions to which it readily connects: the unpresentable, the unthinkable, the intractable, the irredeemable, etc. This inflationary use, in fact, brings under the same concept and surrounds with the same aura of sacred terror all sorts of phenomena, processes, and notions, which range from the mosaic prohibition of representation to the Shoah, passing through the Kantian sublime, the primitive Freudian scene, the large glass of Duchamp, or the white square on a white background of Malevich. End of quote. With this mixture, he continues, we are witnessing the emergence of a new mode of art, which purely and simply attests to its powerlessness. And Rancière criticizes very violently this supposed powerlessness of victim art. Such a vision of art, he explains, stems from a confusion that is both conceptual and historical. A confusion between two very distinct regimes of art, Rancière explains, the representative regime and what he calls the aesthetic regime. Lyotard works with categories of representation and the unpresentable that date from another age. It is therefore necessary for Rancière to make the difference between the classical notion of representation and contemporary representation, which no longer have the same meaning. So let me explain this point that is very important in Rancière's book, Disagreements. Rancière explains that the categories of unrepresentable and unpresentable only make sense from the perspective of traditional representation, characteristic of classical art. This regime of representation coincides, Rancière explains, with classical art, that is the art of the 17th century. and its meaning is therefore entirely relative. In classical art, making representation possible presupposes defining in advance what is not representable by predetermining, he says, Rancière, the relationship between the sayable and the visible. So here comes an example. Rancière takes the example of Corneille, the French writer, who undertook to write an Oedipus in 1659 and found himself confronted with the fact that tragedy was at the time henceforth with the fact that tragedy was henceforth inadmissible for the spectators of his time. The scene of the hero's gouged out eyes, of his blood running down his face, could no longer, for reasons of social decency, be shown. So Corneille had therefore to find the right distance, the right means to succeed in representing the scene of Oedipus blinding himself without showing it. This scene is therefore indeed, if you will, unrepresentable, but does not at the same time compromise its representation. It can simply be adjusted and accommodated by being played behind the curtain. So in fact, Oedipus's gouged eyes takes place behind the curtain. So it becomes, if you want, unrepresentable, but unrepresentable just means behind the curtain. At the same time, everybody knows what is going on behind the curtain. This was the old regime of representation that, according to Rancière, Lyotard goes on using while it has become totally out of date, because a new system of representation has taken place in the 19th century, Rancière explained, with Romanticism. Romanticism, precursor of contemporary art, defined a totally new concept of representation. Indeed, of the unrepresentable, as we have just defined it, there is no more. The period of romantic realism proves this forcefully. I quote Rancière, "What is romantic realism? It is the emancipation of resemblance from representation." So this is important, the emancipation of resemblance from representation, the loss of proportions and representative properties, a fact which has the consequence that everything henceforth is representable. So this is the strong arguments of Rancière that henceforth, for us today, everything is representable. There is no longer anything unpresentable. The need for accommodation, adaptation, and decency that pushed Corneille to represent the scene of the gouged eyes behind the curtain has disappeared. The romantic realism of the 19th century has liberated a way of saying everything by refusing to prioritize the visible. I quote Rancière, "Everything is now on the same plane, big and small, important events and insignificant episodes, and finally, men and things." And for Rancière, the paradigm of this new regime in which everything can be said, everything can be showed, is Flaubert, the French writer, and the paradigm of this paradigm is Flaubert's novel, Madame Bovary. Flaubert is the inventor of this new regime of representation in which everything is on the same level. As Rancière says, everything is on the same plane. And that's why Rancière explains there is now a general availability of all subjects for any art form, a full exposure to performance. And he goes so far as to affirm that this situation of absolute visibility, I quote, "does not know of any objects which put it at fault by their own singularity. It has shown to be perfectly suited to the representation of these phenomena that are said to be unrepresentable, those of the concentration and extermination camps, There are no longer exceptional experiences that would challenge the imagination to present. The representation manifests its own opacity by lifting the barrier of the invisible. Nothing is more unrepresentable, precisely because the regime of representation is over. No one would be offended anymore to see blindness, to have their eyes fixed on gouged eyes. So you see, it is the affirmation that we are living in a regime of representation in which we are not offended anymore by any form of the visible. Everything can be represented, even concentration camps, even extermination camps, etc. So you see, it's very extreme. So let's take some examples. So for Lyotard, I'm sorry, I should have prepared a PowerPoint, but I'm very technically challenged, so I had to renounce. I would have liked to show you what for Lyotard is this time the paradigm of the impresentable. They are Buren's columns. You see the uneven columns that Buren has installed in front of the Palais Royal in Paris. And also, and mostly, Townley's drawings. So Lyotard declares in an interview about these drawings, he says, to draw a line on a surface, any line, is already to produce a minimum of meaning. One recognizes oneself within the poorest forms of art. A simple scribble made with a pencil on a sheet of paper already constitutes for us one of the poorest forms of art. I find that this poverty is almost mystical, is something eminently original. In this sense, I feel closer to drawing than to color. A simple trace of pencil and the paper splits and something is found as directed elsewhere. What you have there is both the most complete form of power and at the same time, the most complete form of dispossession. Because the one who draws this line absolutely does not know what he is doing. This poverty is something perfectly equivocal. It is both everything and nothing. So I like this passage because we can see that what Lyotard calls the unpresentable is the trace that he compares with this drawing when the pencil traces something on the paper. So the trace is not a form. Precisely, the trace pertains more to the sublime than to the beautiful because it doesn't represent anything and it doesn't present anything outside its own poverty, which is outside its own capacity to produce sense or meaning without giving way to a form. So for Lyotard, this trace on the paper is the paradigm of contemporary art. Contemporary art can only be abstract, that is, can only be a scribble, as he says, because through this scribble, you can see the poverty of those who cannot speak. The trace is the expression, the impresentable expression of those who are reduced to silence. Rancière, for his part, privileges literary examples. When he says that now everything is on the same equal footage, that everything is at the same level, he means by that this paratactic style, as he calls it, that we have forms, but they are all juxtaposed on the same line and everything is equal. So he risks an improbable parallel between Madame Bovary, so Flaubert's novel, and this novel about concentration camp written by Robert Antelme called The Human Species, L'Espèce Humaine. They are both supposed for Rancière to speak the same parataxic language. By simply, I quote Rancière, linking one after the other, the small acts and small perceptions. So he compares, for example, the nocturnal silence of the camp described by Antelme, with these moments in Flaubert that mark the moments of love. So, for example, when Antelme writes, "Dogs did not bark, the sentries were quiet," this sentence echoes for Rancière with that of Madame Bovary. She sat down again and resumed her work, which was the white cotton stocking in which she did darnings. She worked, forehead lowered. She did not speak, neither did Charles. The passing air from under the door pushed a little dust on the flagstones, etc. So for Rancière, the two literary expressions, like the camp was silent, the countryside was silent, etc., the two modes of writing, the two styles are identical, even if, of course, they don't say the same thing. And Rancière says the two styles are based on the same relationship between demonstration and signification, the same regime of rarefaction of one and the other. He also says, I quote, "The lived concentration camp experience of Robert Antelme and the invented sensory experience of Emma Bovary are expressed according to the same logic of small perceptions added to each other." So that's why, and I quote Rancière again, Robert Antelme's experience is not unrepresentable. The language exists, the syntax exists. So you see that what Rancière means is that by form, we do not mean something like a beautiful form. When Rancière says now everything can be showed, everything can become visible, everything can become representable, it doesn't mean that everything has to become beautiful. It means that by adding what he calls the little perception to one another, by inventing a plane on which everything can coexist, in fact, the writer, what do? The writers, they figure what radical equality could be. They repair, so to speak, the originary wrong of politics. What Flaubert and Antelme are doing is to signify, by adding little perceptions to one another on an equal footing or footage, they figure what radical equality could be, might be. And this is the process through which, for Rancière, the political subject can encounter their own subjectivation. They can discover through this process the way in which they can be said to be political subjects precisely because of their equality with others. So now I will conclude by presenting a few remarks, a few personal remarks about this conflict. I will start by answering that, in my opinion, no, the language of Antelme is not the same as that of Flaubert, because it brings out a strange distance between all things and all beings from the very heart of their equality. This distance, what interests me in this juxtaposition of the small perceptions is not the perception themselves, but what lies between them, in between them. There is a distance between things and characters and forms that marks the specific inequality that haunts equality and has nothing to do with the arithmetic geometric couple. It seems to me that Rancière does not take into account a certain kind of inequality. Rancière only takes into account the social inequality, but leaves untreated, unperceived, inequality understood as otherness. So much so that the paradoxic juxtaposition, the equality of things and beings, is torn apart by marking the place of the other. Levinas says, when the other speaks, speech is the report of what remains radically separated, affirming a relationship without unity, without equality. And I like this sentence because Levinas here says that you can, of course, put things on the same plane, like stringing pearls, but there will always remain a distance between the pearls. And this distance is that of otherness. That is what he says again, as he says again, remains radically separated. Misery of the mind, Rossière would reply, which transforms me into a hostage of the other. Rossière answers ironically to Levinas. But the problem is precisely there. Rossière's thought fundamentally lacks otherness. The difference is never made between the unequal and the other. But to be radically equal, the subjects are nonetheless other, quite other to each other, and therefore unequal to their equality. And of the difference of this dispute between inequality and otherness, there is neither proof nor representation possible. I think that otherness is unpresentable. Rossière, as we understand, considers illegitimate the saturation of the fields of politics and aesthetics by the dramaturgy of catastrophe. And it is true that perhaps there have been too many affirmations of the importance of the Shoah, of this incapacity in which the artists are to react after the Shoah, to think after Auschwitz, etc. Perhaps we have heard too many discourses of the catastrophe. In that sense, I agree with Rossière. But this does not mean that henceforth everything is representable, because the trace of the other remains. And this trace for Lyotard is what he calls the question of testimony. In fact, for Lyotard, what is unpresentable is not that much the victim, but the capacity to testify for the victim, as he demonstrates in the Différent. And precisely what cannot be represented, but only witnessed or testified, is the trace of the other. Let's go back to anarchism now. And we can say that indeed all anarchists are witnesses. Anarchism, apart from anarchists, no one believes in it. And that because its leading idea, the non-governable, is unpresentable. This idea does not arise spontaneously, either in the mind or in the imagination. Anarchism may not even be an idea. No one believes that humans can live without a government. Anarchism has and will always have to produce its credibility beyond and despite the objective existence of its historical forms. The Paris Commune, the Spanish Civil War, the workers' councils in Germany and Italy, revolutionary syndicalism or unionism, Zapatismo, the political system of Rojava in Western Kurdistan have exist. The black blocs exist, it is a fact. Black Lives Matter exist, it is a fact. And yet, anarchism must constantly testify to its reality, must constantly produce itself as a trace. It must accept that its non-credible dimension for the common conscience, as for the political conscience, is never warded off by the fact and the actuality of its occurrences, of its theoreticians and of its fighters. Faced with the skepticism that welcomes its effectiveness, the anarchist can only give her word about the reality of anarchism. Where no evidence convinces, the anarchist can again only testify. And this is what seals the complicity of anarchism and the unpresentable. That's why I think that today an in-between has to be constructed, which would be situated at the same time beyond the unpresentable, representable quarrel, which would integrate the staging, the visibility, as well as the white line of separation, fragmentation, and testimony. To finish, and that this is my conclusion, I would like to give you, to present, let's say, a touch of anarchist paint. This in-between, visibility and representable, has actually been built, this in-between has actually been building for a long time. The pointillist movement in painting, sometimes called neo-impressionist, then a little later divisionist, was a militant movement which considered the pictorial technique of points as a plastic equivalent of anarchism. I'm sure you know, I don't know how to pronounce that in English, the pointillist movement in painting, in which the paintings are made with little touches or points. So to quote a few painters, Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, Félix Fénéon, to name a few, have never hidden their anarchist commitment. What matters to them was not the subject of the painting. Even if the subjects are absolutely recognizable, let's think, for example, of The Circus or A Sunday Afternoon by Félix Fénéon. So even if these paintings can be considered as figurative because they represent something, at the same time, their authors continue to affirm that the real subject of the painting is precisely not its subject, but its political motive that remains unpresentable. And what is its political motive? It's the radical equality between individuals, which remains unrepresentable and unpresentable. So the radical equality between individuals is figured by the juxtaposition of the points. I quote from Signac, "The subject is nothing," he declares, or at least only part of the work of art. What is important is the evocation of this future in which formalism will no longer oppose popular consciousness. When the eye is educated, the people will see something other than the subject in the paintings. When the society that we dream will exist, when, rid of the exploiters who brutalize him, the worker will have time to think and learn and will appreciate all the various qualities of the work of art. So here we have in this sentence the difference. The painter talks about the difference between the visible subject, which is representable, like an island in the Paris countryside, and what is not representable, and that the educated eyes will learn how to approach. What is unpresentable, is the blank space that separates all the points, like a mosaic. And in fact, the equality of these blank spaces figures, without figuring it, the fundamental political equality of the people. When you observe a pointillist canvas very closely, you can distinctly see that each brush stroke, each color is independent of the others, separated from the others by a wide space. This is a phenomenon that Seurat calls the divided touch. By taking a step back from the canvas, it is the spectator who mixes the colors, and the more he takes a distance, the more the whites seem to disappear. However, even invisible from afar, they never fade away and still continue to be perceived. So the unpresentable continues to be perceived, unconsciously, one might say. The canvas is always white under dot painting. So it is white, so in that sense, it is unpresentable, and at the same time, it can be perceived. In the gradual shift from politics to aesthetics, from distance to proximity, at the heart of the equality of points and touches, there is this otherness which remains white, visible without seeing itself, says everything without saying anything, nor represents. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Catherine. Just going to get Jonathan on the screen here, and then that's fantastic. So I think we'll start. Jonathan, I know you have some questions that you want to start with, and I think Dr. Johnny Golding in the audience also has some questions, but Jonathan, I think you get to start.
Yeah, going back to Kant and the division between the beautiful and the sublime, within the sublime, there's this sort of idea of the starry night above and the moral law within. In other words, there's a kind of hierarchy of moral inwardness in Kant. And you could also say that the difference between the beautiful and the sublime is the difference between the centered subject and decentered subject. So if there's a decentered subject which is based on moral supremacy, where does that leave the politics of the sublime? That's the sort of question which I've always felt is imminent within Kant, but never quite articulated within the subjective turn of philosophy. There's a sort of paradox.
Yes, thank you very much. You're totally right to insist on this subjective effect of the sublime. So it is true that the sublime is an experience of decentering. The subject feels, feels as a consequence of the failure of imagination, feels its own powerlessness in front of the immensity, infinity of nature, Kant says, and feels smashed by it. And at the same time, and this is the moral aspect of it, what appears as a kind of counter experience is the infinity of freedom. This is what Kant says, that the sublime makes finitude appear, and at the same time renders the infinity of freedom visible. So it's a kind of contradictory, and this is what makes it so interesting, a kind of contradictory feeling of both weakness and absoluteness of freedom. So the political consequences, what are they? Well, there are many, of course. It will be a long discussion, and Lyotard has written a lot on this topic. What are the political consequences? The political consequences might be that freedom, and this is a big problem, is per se impresentable. That it can only emerge as a phenomenon or as a form only through the violent experience of the sublime, which means that, aesthetically speaking, no work of art can give a form to freedom. And politically, it is very, it's a very problematic situation, because it means that freedom can always be dismissed, can always go unrecognized. And that the freedom, the fight for making freedom visible has to be constant. Lyotard insists on the fact that it's not, that even what we call democracies are never a guarantee for the visibility of freedom. That is a constant struggle. And art has to sustain this constant freedom, finding a way to make to open the visibility of freedom. So I don't know if I answered to your question, but that might be a way of doing it, of answering.
That's why in Nancy you get this idea of freedom is an eruption rather than a state.
Exactly. It's an eruption. It's not a stable state. It's not something constant. It's not a given. It's not a given.
We move on to another question.
Yes.
I don't think there's a question yet, but I'll ask a question that's a little bit more basic, perhaps. And that I think, Dr. Malibu, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that Lyotard looked at the unpresentable as presenting the sacrifice and responding to the 20th century to the Holocaust. So does that mean that whatever form of the unpresentable or the infinite to Lyotard is always harking back to that kind of loss that can't be explained? And how does that connect to art?
Exactly. It always connects with that. And this is precisely what Rancière disagrees with. That if this is true, then it means that art can only be the echo, eternally repeating itself, this kind of leitmotif of the Shoah. And definitely we have to, for Rancière, we have to break with this. Why that? Because he thinks that this eternal recurrence of the impresentable, unpresentable character of the victims, I will say a word about that in a moment, does not serve it. It's not that Rancière is against that per se. Of course, we have to make the victims heard, but affirming that this phenomenality can only be a trace or something unpresentable or just a trait of pencil on a sheet of paper is not emancipatory, because it doesn't give the possibility for the victims to subjectify themselves, to become genuine political subjects. So as we know, this question of unpresentability emerged for Lyotard with negationism. Like, what do you do when people like Faurisson negate the reality of the gas chambers? When someone like that says, no, we have no proof, because if people have died in the gas chambers, they cannot testify, and the survivors can say, yeah, the gas chamber existed, but why would we believe them? So it is impossible to prove the reality of the gas chambers. And for Lyotard, this has become a major political problem, which is when you cannot represent something. And it is true that if the victims have died, we cannot present them. We cannot. So how do you react? How do you react in front of somebody who denies any kind of representability of a murder, a slaughter, a catastrophe? So for him, there must be a way of testifying. This is what he calls a testimony of, yes, presenting a kind of, in an unpresentable way, of presence. But for Rancière, again, he understands that, but for him, it doesn't do justice to the victims.
Thank you. There's a question from Annette in the audience, and I'll just quote, "You have many books. Which one do you recommend for us to start with to get a better understanding of your theories and concepts?"
Well, thank you for your question. In reality, it's the first time that I'm writing on this conflict between Rancière and Lyotard, but it pertains to my work on plasticity. I have been working for many, many years on this concept, plasticity, which precisely designates both the capacity to to shape something, the capacity to give form to something like plastic arts or plastic surgery, the work of the form, giving form to, and at the same time, the explosion of form, plastic with a C, you know, plastic explosive. So I'm interested in the coincidence between plasticity understood as creation of form and plasticity understood as destruction of forms. So if you want to know more about that, I would, if I may, advise you to read my Hegel book, The Future of Hegel, in which I explain all that with Hegel. And my very recent book on anarchism, that is not yet translated into English, but that will soon be, which is called Anarchism and Philosophy, in which I developed this quarrel between Rancière and Lyotard in a chapter devoted to Rancière, but it's very recent.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then there's another question here from Sarah. Can we compare the unpresentable / presentable discussion to the figurative, abstract, dualistic aspect of art?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that exactly, I should have said that perhaps more clearly. What Lyotard calls the beautiful, while reading Kant, saying that the beautiful can always be represented, it means that it can always be figured. It's figurative art. That for Kant is the summum of the beautiful. Art has to be an imitation of nature. As you know, for Kant, it is clear, and an imitation of nature can only be figurative. That's why, so Kant, of course, doesn't say that the sublime means abstract art, because the concept of abstract art did not exist in Kant's time. This is Lyotard that invents this notion of, well, this proximity between the sublime and the abstract. But you're right, yes, if there is an art of the sublime, it can only be abstract. So absolutely, the discussion between the figurative and the abstract is exactly synonymous with unpresentable and between presentable and unpresentable, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, did you want to kick in with anything else? Otherwise, I'll come up with another question.
Just a short thought about the generations who, for instance, read Hegel. Is first in the 1930s that Kojève was lecturing on Hegel, and then in the post-war years, the response to Hegel, whichever way, shaped the philosophy of that period, and structuralism reacted against that. But there's only really 3 generations of readers there. And I wonder how you see this very short span of time reading such a fundamental book, but over it's a sort of short period really of absorption. I wonder how you think about that.
So well, very briefly, if I want to be very schematic, I would say that yes, there was the Kojève period in which Hegel appeared as the emancipatory thinker announcing Marx, and mostly because of the master slaves, to speak briefly, dialectic. Then there was the second moment when Hegel appeared, on the contrary, as the paradigmatic dominant thinker who never accounted for precisely the catastrophes of the 20th century because of his vision of history as teleological. And then there's a third epoch to which I belong, which is a rereading of Hegel that is totally new. And for example, we can also put Zizek into this category, like people trying to, and I'm also situating myself in the third period, trying to demonstrate that Hegel is neither one, neither the Marxist, pre-Marxist thinker, nor the thinker of totalitarianism. But I think that would be another discussion. So I think there's another question about, yeah, what way, can I read it, Lester?
Yeah, go ahead.
What way can the irrepresentable represent the representable without representability? This is precisely, this is a very interesting question. This is, I think, this is what Rancière tries to do. I was answering the previous question by saying, yes, it pertains to the difference between figurative art and abstract art. But precisely, Rancière is trying to dig out a category of representation that would not be figurative. When he says, for example, that everything has to be on the same plane, you know, things, man, etc., the human, things, animals, etc. It's not that each point of representation has a form, but what interests him is the plane itself. So Lyotard would answer, but this is what I'm trying to do. In fact, Lyotard would answer, this is what I try to do, except that what you call representable in this new sense, I call impresentable. So both, I think, are trying to create a way of showing that is not representable in the traditional sense, but which is more a vision of the plane, what Deleuze might call a plane of immanence. But they disagree on something fundamental, which is that for Rancière, the plane can become visible. And perhaps we have to work on the difference between visible and representable. For Rancière, the plane can become visible. The plane of immanence can become visible, rather than for Lyotard, the plane, just like in the neo-impressionist painting I was mentioning, remains white, remains like a sheet of paper. And so, yes, we would have to work on the difference between representable and visible.
Okay, there's actually Professor Johnny Golding. Johnny, just you've got the floor if you want to ask your question there. Maybe she can't hear. I'll read Dr. Golding's question. Would the political question asked here change if one could look beyond classic media such as painting?
Yes, I think this is a true question. I'm sorry, because my examples were very classical, because I just took the ones provided by Rancière and Lyotard. I think your question resonates with, well, what if we translated all this into pixels? What, for example, what I said about post-impressionist painting, can it be translated into new digital arts, and in particular the question of the pixels? In my opinion, yes. I think that what Lyotard and Rancière are discussing, are talking about, can be almost perfectly, even if some changes have to be made, of course, can be translated into digital arts. I think so. Because the problem remains that of the plane of immanence that sustains all the points or touches, or, yeah. But maybe you know more than me on that topic.
Okay, there's questions in the Q&A, so we should jump over to that. Leo asked, it seems that Rancière implies a strong political responsibility that the artist has, which is to give a voice to the unheard. From this position, he points out the problem with having something irrepresentable. What is there with no responsibility put on the artist and they just made art? Is there still a problem then with the idea of something irrepresentable with the sublime?
I think I would have to reread the question.
It's a little bit difficult. It's worded a little bit difficult. It's in the Q&A if you want to read it there.
Okay.
At the very top of the Q&A.
All right, let me see. Because no, I don't have it on the Q&A.
Oh, sorry. I'll read it one more time. It's because I think Leo his native language, I think, is French. So maybe we should just ask him to ask it in French. But it seems that Rancière implies a strong political responsibility that the artist has to give a voice to the unheard.
Yeah. Okay.
From this position, he points out the problem with having something irrepresentable.
No, that's the word I don't understand. It's not Rancière who says that there's something irrepresentable. Precisely not. This is why I don't understand. It's not a matter of language. It's a matter of a concept. Precisely, Rancière affirms that there's nothing irrepresentable. And the question of the sublime is not Rancière's question, but Lyotard's.
And I think the other bit that Leo's trying to ask there, if I'm just trying to rephrase it, is it okay? I'll put it in my own words. Is it okay for an artist to make something that he or she feels is sublime and irrepresentable, as opposed to having the thought of Lyotard's, of something touching something deeper or the different? And I hope, Leo, I got that right.
No, I think well, the sublime, you know, for Kant, the sublime is so extreme that no art form can express it. Kant is adamant about that. The sublime can only be a natural phenomenon in the sense of natural catastrophe, like a tsunami, or I remember he takes the example of a massive thunderstorm or a sea tempest, or you see. So for Kant, and this is an aporia of the third critique, art is not able to figure, I don't know, or represent or not represent the sublime. It is Lyotard who inherits this question and declares, and this is Lyotard's strong intervention, in reality, yes, we can find an artistic expression of the sublime, but it has necessarily to be impresentable. You cannot, it is impossible to give to this conflict of the imagination and reason, etc., to give it a form. So Rancière answers, the sublime does not exist. It's not that we can find a form to it, or that he contradicts Lyotard on the point of, is there an artistic form of the sublime? No, he says the sublime does not exist. This is a total invention.
Okay, thank you. There's several other questions there, so I'll go in time order. So going to the Q&A, Caroline asks, how would you link what you were expounding in relation to beautiful and sublime to the plasticity of aging?
Well, this is a question that unsettles me because I was not expecting it. And I wonder why you're asking. Immediately, what I would answer immediately, but this is really immediate, is that we would have to change ground. I mean, we would have to shift grounds, because this makes me think, your question makes me think of Bergson. When Bergson says that aging cannot be quantitatively described, but only qualitatively. And he distinguishes, I think it's in Matter and Memory, he distinguishes a form visible, quantitatively visible, that is a form that is made of additions, and a form that is made of qualitative intensities. And in order to give an example, it takes aging. And it says that, for example, when a face is changing out of aging, it cannot be just quantitative, that is a quantity of wrinkles or folds, or it's not a matter of quantity, it's a matter of an intensive internal change. So there are two different plasticities at stake here, extensive and intensive, quantitative and qualitative. So we might refer that to the sublime and the beautiful, but I will have to work more on that.
Okay, thank you for that. Then
but you know,
Ben,
Lester, I don't have the same questions on my chat.
oh, I'm not making them up. Well, it's because what's happening is people are putting things in the chat and things in the Q&A. So I think it's it's a little bit confusing, but that's okay. We'll work it out. Ben Clark asks, you were talking, and this is in the chat, 613, you were talking about the difference between otherness and inequality in Rancière and Derrida.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't being less than equal also a form of otherness, something worthy of shame? Also interested in this anarchism question. I spoke a lot with Paul Preston, who is a historian of the Spanish Civil War, who said that the anarchists never really had a hope. They were practically unpresentable as in the war, as help could only be asked for via communism, the Spanish Communist Party and the Soviet Union. Forgive my patchy knowledge of French history, but did the pointillist painters actually have links to the political anarchists? Where does Courbet's role in the Paris Commune figure into it? That's about 10 questions in there, but that's okay.
Yeah, no. But anyway, thank you so much, because I think this is a very good question, and I totally agree. I think we're totally in agreement that I was interested in the anarchist question for many reasons, but one of them was precisely what is the regime of visibility of anarchism? Why is that communism and all forms of radical political positions are tolerated in the public sphere? They have their visibility, their representability, and their legitimacy. And why is anarchism, on the contrary, always criticized, always disqualified as a non-viable form of politics, as a naive thing or violent thing? And I think it is because of a specific regime of visibility, which is that, as I said to argue in my talk, that nobody believes in it. It's just like, it's comparable in that sense to, or with concentration camps in a very, very specific way, which is that we can only testify, even if we know that objectively anarchist moments have taken place, nobody believes it. We have to constantly provide the testimony for, so yes, of course, the pointillist painters have a direct link with anarchists, and we would have to reread. I think I learned that from Antliff. You know, is he British or American? Antliff, you know, the one who worked very interestingly on art and anarchism, showing that Delacroix, Courbet, and all the painters I mentioned were directly linked with these new anarchist ideas that were so popular in the 19th century. So I don't remember what your question was, but thank you very much, because I think we're totally in agreement. Yeah.
Okay, and then jumping back into the Q&A, there's Xin-Ming, which is a little bit tied into Johnny Golding's question, I think. And quoting Xin-Ming says, this might be out of context, but do you consider Gilbert Simondon's theory of individuation as remedies for the unrepresentables in the digital age?
Well, I'm not a specialist, thank you. I'm not a specialist of Simondon, but I know that many people, yes, would answer yes to your question. That individualization is I think Simondon uses the term plasticity, if I remember well, that individualization is a plastic process in which the individual, precisely, the singularity takes form. And at the same time, this form is not comparable to the Kantian beautiful. So yes, I would say that, but we would have to read more closely the text. But yes, I would say that Simondon can help the transposition or the translation of this quarrel into the digital age. I think so, that technology here is important.
Okay, thank you. And then jumping back into the chat, Jess Martin asks, to your point around the unrepresentability of otherness, I agree. If I understand you correctly, that which is beyond our visual dimension cannot be represented by it, but I wonder if it still leaves a trace in the visible. To take a simple example, if a sphere passed through a 2D world, it wouldn't be seen as a sphere, and in this sense is unrepresentable, but it would be seen as the trace of the increasing, decreasing concentric circles as a pulse. And so I wonder if, in this sense of the pulse, that otherness may be visible insofar as it overlaps with our visual dimension.
It's a beautiful question, but very, very difficult. Well, let me make a very simplistic answer. I recently watched a movie. I don't know if it came out in the UK. It's called Everything, Everywhere, and All at Once. This is about, so the topic of the movie, it's a history of a family, doesn't matter at all. What matters is the process of constant morphing of the images. And the central character of the film is not the topic, it's not the characters themselves, but the constant morphing of images that is akin to the concept of multiverse. And it seems to me that what digital age is doing, and if we want to relate this new process to our discussion, is to show once again that what is important is not that much the forms of the characters or of things or of the plot, but the plane, once again, on which everything happens. And what was so interesting for me in that movie, that is not that interesting per se, but there's something interesting, which is that the plane of immanence itself can be constantly transformed. And I think this is a new artistic process, a new artistic claim, that in fact what is important is the plasticity of the ground, not that much of the characters but of the ground itself. That, as you said, becomes a matter of concentric circles, of unrecognizability of the plane itself.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll jump back into the Q&A, and Udit Datta asks, do you also agree that the non-governable is unrepresentable? How does one explain the liberation of queer art / music / culture that represents an entanglement of otherness that seems to be taking ungovernable forms all around us?
So I thank you very much. I do think that the non-governable, which is not the ungovernable, is unrepresentable. And as you know, anarchism is a critique of representation, of political representation. Anarchism is a critique of government in general on the basis of a critique of representation. Anybody who represents me is distorting my thinking, my desires, etc. Doesn't mean that, once again, and I think I was clear about that in my talk, it doesn't mean that the non-governable cannot be expressed. The problem is, once again, how to create a form of expression that does not reduce the expression to a classical form of representation. And I think I'm not familiar with what you call the queer, I don't know, anarchist scene, but I'm sure that you would agree with me that this expression of resistance, of critique, of governmentality, you would agree with me that it cannot take the shape of a classical representative form. Huh? I think of punk music, for example, the mosh pit, things like that, are forms of expression that have nothing to do with the classical, beautiful form.
Okay, thank you. And then there's another question from Alia in the chat, and it says, I'm looking at the relationship between plasticity and mourning. I realize this is a very large topic, but perhaps you might be able to say a few things as the most important key aspects of the relationship between plasticity and mourning.
I think there's, of course, Freud himself talks about the plasticity of mourning, because mourning, when successful, is the incorporation of the other, of the deceased, into oneself. And in that sense, mourning someone for Freud means interiorizing his or her form to confer the absent person, to confer its a psychological form that can be interiorized. The problem is that, is there something like a successful mourning? That's the problem. And Freud himself doubts it by saying that melancholia is perhaps always winning the game. And melancholia, as you know, is the production of a non-interiorizable presence of the deceased. And it is impossible to incorporate the deceased. And that's why the melancholic grief is never suspendable. It never ends. Of course, it refers to our discussion, because a possible interpretation of Lyotard would be that abstract art is a process of constant melancholic affirmation of those who cannot speak, that we cannot mourn them. We can only express a melancholic grief.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then in the Q&A, jumping over to there, Mary Lynn asks, in the context of your argument, what is the role of the artist who is working within a catastrophe of otherness, for instance, in a refugee camp? Is it of testimony?
I think so, yes. Of course, this is what the only thing it can be. Of course. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then Chris Simpson asks, what if, or sorry, if the visible is representable and truth is supposed, how can the visible be representative of truth?
Well, what is truth, of course. So I think here, I'm sorry, but we have to go back to Kant. There are, in a certain sense, two kinds of truth. What is true for the understanding, and what is true for the understanding is the representable, the beautiful. As you know, in the first critique, truth is always linked with representation in an objective sense, and the beautiful is the aesthetic translation of the representation for understanding. And there's another kind of truth, which is the truth of reason. And as we know, the sublime deals with reason, not with the understanding. And the problem is that the truth, the rational truth, which deals with ideas and infinity, is not representable. And this is what gives way to the sublime. So what is the visibility of truth? I would say that the visibility of the truth of the understanding is the form, the representative form, and the visibility of rational truth is the trace, as Lyotard explains.
Okay, great, thank you. Laura asks, is there a link with the irrepresentable and the algorithmic personalization of the public space, i.e. the personalization of the feed?
Of the, sorry, of the,
Feed, F-E-E-D. Not quite sure what that means, but
what
hopefully
is it? I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know what it is.
I don't either. Do you know, Jonathan?
No.
No. Okay. Well, just forget the bracket. So I'll just read the question bit of it. Is there a link with the irrepresentable and the algorithmic personalization of the public space?
But I don't understand what the algorithmic personalization of the public space is either. I'm sorry.
Is there a link with the irrepresentable and the personalization of the public space? Don't know.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, I can't answer this question because I don't understand it.
Okay, not to worry. Anonymous question, does the figural come into play here? And I might have been responding to something particular, but maybe you want to just talk about the figural a little bit, because I think Lyotard speaks about the figural as well.
Yes, Lyotard speaks about the figural and also Deleuze. In his Bacon book. So the figural for Lyotard is not exactly the representable. It's not exactly the form. It is, if I remember well, the figural and discourse figure is the artistic expression of a concept. Because in discourse figure, Lyotard talks about what the relationship between philosophy and concepts and art. And he says, art is the I at the edge of discourse. So we have discourse like concepts, and we have the I, which is art. And so the figural in art is the way in which an artist can give an I to a concept. This is a figure. It can be a form. It can be also something unpresentable.
Okay, thank you. And coming back to that question on, let me just find it here. Is there a link with the irrepresentable and the personalization of the public space? She clarified it to say like a Twitter feed. So in other words, does Twitter or the social media, how does that link or conflict with the
Okay. Yeah, now I understand. I would say that it totally relates to what we're talking about, because as you know, Musk just bought Twitter. And you know why? Because, well, among other reasons, he wants to make everything representable, which is sayable. As you know, he says, oh, now I want Twitter to be the realm of absolutely free speech so that everybody can say whatever they want. So in a sense, it is the openness of social medias to absolute representation. Until now, I mean, there have been limits to representation and to speech, for which in many respects are the same, representation and speech. Now, I'm afraid we're entering the moments of a total availability of public space to any kind of speech and representability. I don't know what it will give way to, but it's very problematic, and you're right, it's directly linked with what we are talking about, because Rancière's problem, I mean, what is problematic in Rancière is that he says, if we represent everything, it's good because it gives a form to anarchy, the fundamental anarchy of society. Yes, okay, but it is also what gives way to repression and the expression of fascist ideas and extreme ideas, you see, because there's no limit.
Okay, thank you. Leo has come back on his question earlier, and he said, and I'll just read the question, his follow-up, says, what if there is no responsibility put on the artist? He or she has no duty to give a voice then. Is there then still a problem with something being irrepresentable?
Yes, you might argue that after all, the artist doesn't have a duty, a political duty. You're right that perhaps all this is moralizing a little bit too much the task of the artist, who would be responsible for a very difficult task. And you're right that after all, we can refuse that by saying we don't care about that. Art has nothing to do with this heavy duty of representing or not representing the catastrophe, etc. But unfortunately, I think that the question is inevitable. That how can we just say the artist has no political duty? It's not clear to me, that we can escape the question.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask a question. And again, this is maybe coming back to just a basic question. And you talked about Rancière and talking about that Rancière's view that Romanticism defined the new concept of representation, that everything could be represented. But from my limited knowledge of Romanticism, it seemed to me to be coming out of Western Christian philosophy, where there was an understanding in symbology of Christ and otherness and the unlimited, which then it seemed to me the Romanticists were trying to continue that, but in a different form. So that seems very different from the way that Rancière was trying to interpret it.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what you're referring to.
Well, I guess
maybe we have to be more specific about what we call Romanticism. I don't know if Rancière is right, but for him, Romanticism is the second half of the 19th century. And in writers like Zola or Flaubert, the link with Christianity is not that obvious, but I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fine. So Jonathan, did you have any more questions that you wanted to bring up or any other points?
I think we've had a very good session tonight. I think we're getting close to exhaustion. You've been brilliant. The question answers have been, I mean, the range of mental...
Yeah, it is very interesting, but I'm sorry, there are many other questions on my chat.
I think we've covered them all, except there's one that's just come in from Ben, and we'll just cover this one and then maybe wrap up after that.
Okay.
So Ben asks, can you say something about privacy or invisibility as related to visibility or representation? Is it also an end, something worth fighting for? Perhaps something like a right to keep things to oneself or within the private realm?
Okay, thank you very much. This is very interesting. I think immediately that this is a question that Agamben asks in the use of bodies by insisting on not private life, because he's very adamant to distinguish between private life and something other, which is the form of life. A form of life for him, and he refers for that to Guy Debord, that opposes the society of spectacle, as you know, to this kind of intimacy. Yes, a form of life would be what escapes this big domains of representation or visibility, and yes, that would be a form, it would exist, a form of political resistance that instead of insisting on the dilemma between representation and irrepresentation, would develop, on the contrary, a form of withdrawal as a form of resistance. That would be the form of life brought to light by Debord and these people, and the Invisible Committee. You remember this term, Invisible Committee? Invisible is interesting here because invisible means private, not private, but intimate. So yes, this is something we might explore more deeply.
Okay, I think we probably worn you out there. So I think
it was a good morning exercise. So, no, thank you so much. It was a very interesting discussion. I mean, all the questions were brilliant, and I'm very pleased because in the beginning, I was wondering if the topic would interest you. So I'm very pleased.
Well, again, it's terrific, and thank you so much for being so generous to give your time and to come on board.
No, that's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Very, very grateful.
Thank you for being an anarchist and come to a student-led forum.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your invitation. And Jonathan, take care, and I hope to see you soon.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Brilliant.
everybody, so Catherine, thank you very much, and everybody else, thank you very much for attending and fantastic questions. And
Yeah,
thank you again, Catherine, for everything. So
very
much.
welcome.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.